Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 18th of June 2012, the podcast that works hard for the money, so you'd better treat it right. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's shoot flaming arrows at the news of the bogus. We've reported several times on this podcast about private initiatives that help the homeless, that have been harassed and even shut down by government. But there's good news for the homeless in Tampa. A creative initiative is helping them out thanks to a newspaper called the Tampa Epoch. Of course, politicians hate it, saying that it's an end run around their restrictions on panhandling. Over 13,000 copies of the paper have been sold, and each sale helps out the homeless person hawking the paper on the street. Over 200 vendors have signed up, and the paper is so successful, it's even getting calls from international publishers. Tampa has laws against panhandling, but newspaper vendors are exempt. So these homeless operate completely within the law, bettering themselves and helping them get the things they need. One of them, Bob Friend, has been selling the paper since it first came out, and now no longer engages in panhandling. Quote, "I'm making enough to get everything I need. Groceries, mouthwash, things like that. It's a hand up, not a handout." Another vendor, Atia Brown, says she makes about $35 selling the paper for 2 hours. That's $17.50 an hour, compared to Florida's minimum wage of $7.67 an hour. Response from the community has been overwhelmingly positive. In addition to purchasing newspapers, members of the public have been giving tips of $20 or even $100. In one case, one of them was accosted by a cop, but instead of being hassled, like he was afraid, the cop gave him $20. Seems that everyone likes it. Everyone, that is, except for local politicians. According to Mayor Bob Buckhorn, quote, "The community spoke loudly and clearly. They don't want panhandling to continue." Oh, really? Is that why they're getting all these donations from members of the community? Is that why the paper is so immensely successful in such a short period of time? The fact of the matter is, politicians don't like panhandling because it puts the failure of their own policies in public view for all to see. Banning panhandling doesn't help the homeless one bit, just the opposite. But as long as it makes it appear like there are fewer homeless people, as long as there are fewer of them in your face where you can see the problem, they can brag to their constituents about what a good job they're doing. And then some private entrepreneur steps forward with something that really helps the homeless and puts the issue in public view again. And the politicians whine. That's what worried Brown. Quote, "There's a lot of homeless people out there that need to be heard. This is the only way that we can survive." Mayor Buckhorn went on, quote, "This paper has allowed the panhandlers to take advantage of a loophole. They are trying to skirt the law, and it's just not the right thing to do." Okay, so maybe they are taking advantage of a loophole, but it's a loophole in a law that shouldn't even exist to begin with. And if the law stops homeless people from bettering themselves, from improving their station in life, then it absolutely is the right thing to do. He continues, quote, "And I hope that those who advertising in this paper or buying it out on the streets realize that they are perpetuating a bigger problem." What? What problem? The homeless being helped? The homeless actually making money to afford things that they need? The very same homeless that your precious government has failed to support time and time again, despite much bleeding to the contrary? Once again, this puts lie to the claim the government is there to help the poor and the market won't do it. Once again, we see that people are good and generous, and even clever at getting around the roadblocks government puts in the way of helping the poor and the homeless. Whether it's newspaper vendors or homeless hotspots, street advertisers, or neighborhood barbecues, soup kitchens, people will continue to innovate and find ways to really help the poor and the homeless. If we want to help the poor, we don't need more government. We need to get it out of the way. Well, now we get to see what happens when the Supreme Court is unanimous. In an 8-0 ruling, they ruled that 2 Secret Service agents who violated a citizen's First Amendment rights are immune from prosecution. When you or I break the law, even some ridiculous bureaucratic rule, we pay the price. When government agents violate the supreme law of the land, nothing. In 2006, Stephen Howards visited a shopping mall in Colorado with his son when he learned that Vice President Dick Cheney was there greeting the public. He planned to go to the vice president and voice his opposition to the Iraq War, asking him how many kids he's killed today. But a Secret Service agent overheard him telling this to someone on the phone, and after Howard's approached Cheney and voiced his opposition, the agents confronted and questioned Howard's. Then they arrested him for assault because he had lightly touched Cheney on the shoulder. The charges were dropped, but this was clear retaliation for Howard's exercising his First Amendment rights. Howard sued the agents, and although the trial court ruled in favor of the agents, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that ruling. But then it went to the Supreme Court. The Rutherford Institute, arguing for the plaintiff, argued that such action was the only deterrent possible against agents who violate someone's constitutional rights. But the Supreme Court disagreed, unanimously. And Clarence Thomas wrote the opinion of the court, quote, "The right in question is not a general right to be free from retaliation for one's speech, but the more specific right to be free from a retaliatory arrest. This court has never held that there is such a right." That's right. Every single Supreme Court justice, each of whom swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, denied each and every one of us the only possible legal remedy we could have for being arrested in retaliation for us exercising those rights. They just gave the police carte blanche to arrest whomever they want, protesters, demonstrators, whoever, without facing any legal consequences for their illegal actions. Not a single Supreme Court justice stood up for our rights. Not one. And that's their job. I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it until it sinks in. Judges are nothing more than politicians in black robes. The responsibility for defending our rights falls on you and me, and we cannot surrender that to the idea that the Supreme Court is a group of holy saints who are the only ones who know what the Constitution really means. Because if we keep doing that, pretty soon, we'll have no rights left at all. We hear it all the time. If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. But that wasn't the case with Terrell McCullum, arrested and convicted of carrying a shotgun and a rifle, and who is currently serving out his sentence in federal prison, even though what he did violates no law whatsoever. And it's not just him. A USA Today investigation uncovered 60 men in North Carolina who went to prison for possessing firearms who broke no firearm laws at all, and the Justice Department is actually opposing their release. The law they were convicted under makes it a federal crime for a felon to possess firearms. The problem is, none of these men were felons under the law. Yet the Justice Department has not notified any of these men that they are innocent, and when the men came forward on their own, the Justice Department argued in court that they should not be released. Incredible. And why? The Justice Department says that's not their job. Gee, what were we thinking? That the job of the Justice Department actually had something to do with justice? Silly us! According to federal law, a felon, and therefore someone who isn't allowed to possess firearms, is someone who committed a crime serious enough to warrant at least 1 year in prison. But McCullum hadn't done anything like that. He pleaded guilty to stealing a gun, which at most would have warranted him 10 months in prison. Not enough to qualify him as a felon under this law. And mitigating circumstances, such as the fact that McCullum is mentally disabled, meant that he was only sentenced to probation. At his trial, even his own lawyer said he violated federal law and advised him to plead guilty. Yes, that's right, the very people who were supposed to be on his side and who were supposed to do everything within the bounds of the law to ensure their client's release just hung him out to dry, telling him to plead guilty of something that isn't even a crime. And now they're refusing to release him, and dozens of others just like him. According to U.S. Attorney and federal stooge Ann Tompkins, quote, "We can't be outcome-driven." WTF? You can't be outcome-driven? Yeah, who cares about outcomes? Who cares that there are innocent people locked up in prison for doing something that isn't even a crime? She continues, quote, "We've got to make sure we follow the law, and people should want us to do that. Yes, we do want you to do that. We want you to follow the law that says you do not imprison innocent people. That's in the supreme law. You know, the U.S. Constitution, the one you swore an oath to uphold. You can't throw people in jail for doing something that's not against the law. Let them out. Understand, this isn't a case where new DNA evidence or something comes forward showing they're innocent, or otherwise undermines the prosecution's case, something that needs to be reviewed. The facts are not in dispute. The law is not in dispute. There is no question whatsoever that the actions these men took are not crimes. It's enough of an injustice that these men were convicted to begin with, or even brought to trial at all. But it's absolutely unthinkable that this fact would not be enough to guarantee their immediate release. Yet in a court filing, government lawyers said that the prisoners shouldn't be released because the facts haven't changed. Okay, sure, the fact that they were innocent of any crime hasn't changed. How is that possibly a reason not to release them? Folks, this is the absolute worst case scenario. Not even an innocent person going to prison for a crime he didn't commit, but an innocent person going to prison for something that isn't a crime at all. If there were new evidence, they could at least get a new trial, or at least a hearing. But in this case, the government students just whined that there's nothing they could do, which can only mean they put the law on a higher level than the very people the law is supposed to protect. And it also means they're very selective about which laws they're following, ignoring the supreme law, the Constitution, which doesn't even permit them to do this in the first place. A prosecutor could sign a form and have them released. A judge could bang a gavel and have them released. Who would ever challenge such a decision or hold them accountable for it? Moreover, the president himself could pardon them, but apparently he won't, despite the fact that a presidential pardon cannot be challenged in court. It just goes to show how little those in power care about the people or about justice, instead worshiping the law like it's the holy gospel. This has to stop. And now it's time to deport to Antarctica, this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And once again, it's Paul Krugman, whose determination to bend the facts to fit his pet theory, instead of the other way around like they do in real science, is taken to the extreme that he's lost the ability most elementary school students have to tell when one number is bigger than another. It all has to do with economic indicators regarding the country of Estonia, whose fiscally responsible policy, which Krugman calls austerity, have lifted them out of depression with a remarkable recovery and unemployment dropping like a stone. Krugman tries to paint this recovery as incomplete, as if the same couldn't be said of our economy, where ridiculous levels of Keynesian stimulus spending, topping $20 trillion if you include the Federal Reserve's contributions, has left us with nothing but stagnation. Most of us would welcome Estonia's incomplete recovery. Krugman always wants to blame failed recoveries on government cutbacks, even when no such cutbacks actually happen. He blames the poor economic performance in the UK on cutbacks, even though every single year government spending in the UK has risen. He even laughably says this about the US. Just a couple of weeks ago, he said of US government spending, quote, "We haven't seen spending cuts like this since the demobilization that followed the Korean War." Even though both total government spending and deficit spending have risen to greater levels every single year. Like I said, can't even tell when one number is bigger than the other. Oh, and by the way, we had a decade of prosperity after the Korean War. Funny how he doesn't seem to want to point that out. But give a Wu credit on the rare occasions he deserves it. With Estonia, he has an actual example of government really cutting spending. Krugman claims that these spending cuts resulted in, quote, "a terrible depression-level slump, followed by a significant but still incomplete recovery. Better than no recovery at all, obviously, but this is what passes for economic triumph?" There are a couple of big problems here. First, Krugman keeps looking for these sexy double-digit growth rates for proof of austerity working, but he just doesn't understand the difference between sustainable growth and an unsustainable bubble. The growth he's talking about, like the growth leading up to the crash, is an unsustainable bubble, where too much gets invested in the wrong places and you have an illusion of greater prosperity than there really is. Sustainable growth may be slower, but it is, get this, sustainable. Seems like Krugman's mommy should have read him the story of the tortoise and the hare. The problem is, Krugman cherry-picks his data. It's just invalid to compare an economic recovery, which should be trending toward sustainable growth, to the growth during a financial bubble. The thing to do is look at growth rates before the bubble and compare them to now. Doing this shows clearly that the bubble represents an anomalous growth rate, and the current growth rate matches what we would expect from the long-term trend. And yet, in a different blog post, Krugman said, quote, "Since the austerity stimulus debate is about slumps, not long-run growth, talking about growth before the crisis is just irrelevant." Yeah, because he wants it to be, he needs it to be irrelevant, so he can support his failed policy with cherry-picked data. But there's a bigger problem. His numbers just don't work out. The first thing to understand is that Estonia didn't get onto the euro until 2011, and most of their growth was before this happened. But the biggest one is the timing of the austerity measures. They didn't come into play until after the slump. The slump itself was accompanied by an explosion in government spending, and things didn't improve until they cut spending, which they did, resulting in a 7.6% growth rate, better than any other country in the European Union, along with the lowest public debt per GDP of 6%, and also the only one with a budget surplus. The data are clear. Spending cuts and surpluses helped Estonia grow. You cannot blame the current low state of the economy on so-called austerity. You can blame it on high government spending. You cannot say that austerity led to a slow recovery because Estonia is recovering much faster than its neighbors in the EU. In order to make any of this the fault of austerity, which Krugman wants so desperately to do, then the economic results of the government spending cuts and surpluses would have to travel backwards in time. Krugman apparently thinks economic indicators move faster than light. Either that, or he's just unable to tell when one number is bigger than another. Of course, the real fail is even calling this austerity to begin with. Austerity is when severe hardship is imposed upon you from the outside. What's happening in Estonia is a much more responsible level of government spending, self-imposed so that people don't have to live in austerity. Really, this is like looking at someone who's dieting and saying they're starving, and screaming about all the problems of malnutrition when all they're trying to do is get their weight down to a more healthy level. If Krugman took the same approach to nutrition that he does to economics, he'd weigh 500 pounds by now. Estonian President Toomas Hendrik had some choice words for Krugman on Twitter. Examples. "Let's write about something we know nothing about and be smug, overbearing, and patronizing. Guess a Nobel in trade means you can pontificate on fiscal matters and declare my country a wasteland. Must be a Princeton versus Columbia thing. But yes, what do we know? We're just dumb and silly East Europeans, unenlightened. Let's on East Europeans. Their English is bad, won't respond, and actually do what they've agreed to and re-elect governments that are responsible." In an interview, Hendrik was clear, quote, "You can achieve growth through austerity. Estonia has done that. If you look at the list of things on the so-called growth agenda, the last line is the internal market. That should be the first line. The other solutions, primary solutions, basically mean more of what we're already doing wrong, which is borrowing money to pay for things. If in the name of solidarity you exploit responsibility and you get to the point where you're asking people poorer than you to bail you out for following policies that poorer people never even thought of following, then that's not sustainable." Gee, sounds kind of like our policy here in the US, doesn't it? Krugman's response was just as moronic as his original claim. Without even trying to track down what Hendrik really said, Krugman just said, quote, "Since some people insist that Estonia's partial, but only partial, recovery from a severe economic crisis demonstrates the wonders of austerity, would they also agree that the evidence below demonstrates the incredible success of FDR's New Deal policies of promoting unions, raising wages, and increasing government employment?" He then shows a partial graph of GDP during the Great Depression, ending in 1937. Of course, there are things that Krugman doesn't bother to point out, such as the fact that government spending is part of GDP, so increasing government spending will necessarily increase it, even if people are doing no better than they were. Of course, Krugman doesn't show us what private GDP was doing during that time. In the case of Estonia, government spending being lower means that the increase in GDP represents an even greater increase in private productivity. And even then, his own chart only shows the economy just getting past where it was in 1929. He can't even cherry-pick impressive growth. And then, of course, there's the troublesome little fact that people were pretty much as bad off in 1937 as they were in 1933. It was still the Great Depression, after all, but who cares about the quality of life for the average person when you've got a line on a graph to look at? Estonia is far from an isolated incident. Canada, Ireland, Slovakia, and New Zealand have all had success stories in the recent past from cutting government spending and debt. And even in the United States, the massive post-World War II cuts in taxes and spending ushered in the most productive years of the 20th century. How big of a woo do you have to be in order to try and make something that is repeatedly shown to work look like a bad idea? Krugman says we're not out of the economic slump because we didn't spend enough. Yeah, and the patient died because we didn't use enough leeches. But austerity results in incomplete recovery. Just like a cancer patient who can live out the rest of his life in reasonable health thanks to modern medicine, but still suffers a few health problems. Incomplete recovery. If only they had used leeches. And it's that sort of staggeringly moronic thinking, along with the time-traveling econometrics, that once again earns Paul Krugman the title of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to dock the pay of this week's Idiot Extraordinare! Okay, so we've gotten used to pundits shooting off their mouth about things they know nothing about, stubbornly refusing to look at the facts in order to support their pet political theories. But when such a person ends up going against the very problem they want to solve, there's just no way it's anything other than sheer idiocy. Case in point, Rachel Maddow, who is just so insistent on government stepping in to fix what she claims is discrimination in the workplace, regardless of the data showing otherwise, and in doing so, avoiding and even preventing fixing the real inequalities facing women in America today.
There's one thing that just about every single job in America has in common. Dudes get paid more for doing it. If you are a driver, men get paid more. If you are a manager, men get paid more. If you are a janitor, men get paid more. If you're a retail salesperson, men get paid more. If you're a sales rep, if you are a cook, a chief executive, a security guard, a police officer, a customer service representative, in all of those cases, men get paid more. If you are a secretary, men get paid more. If you are a teacher, men get paid more. If you're a nurse, men get paid more. If you're a cashier, men get paid more. If you're a receptionist, a financial manager, if you wait tables, men get paid more. Women get paid 77 cents for every dollar that men get paid. For the same work, dudes get paid more.
Okay, thinking about this for, a nanosecond, if it is true that women are getting paid less than men for the same work, then why aren't the firms laying off men and hiring women during this recession to get cheaper workers? Why don't we have full employment among women? If these greedy, profit-seeking corporations want to hire workers at the lowest wages possible, then why would they ever hire men? It's almost as if something else is going on here.
In Republican world, it is not a problem. Not it's happening and we don't mind, but it's not happening. In Republicans' minds, women don't get paid less than men in this country.
This is incredibly disingenuous. No one is disputing the aggregate figure, only the meaning that can be attached to it. You cannot just look at pay discrepancy and assume the only possibility is discrimination against women. The fact is, as numerous studies show, the discrepancy between incomes has much more to do with other factors such as education, experience, work history, lots of other factors. In order to come to a proper conclusion, you need to do a regression analysis, controlling for these other factors. Maddow doesn't do that. She just points to the aggregate and says if you don't agree with her, you're a sexist Republican who refuses to use his brain. But the fact is, when most of these other factors are controlled for, the discrepancy falls below the level of statistical significance. In a 2009 report from the U.S. Department of Labor, they found improvements in many of these metrics. 59% of women were in the labor force, up from 43% in 1970. One-third of women in the labor force have a college degree, up from 17.9% in 1970. More women are in managerial, professional, and other high-paying occupations. And the wage gap the metric Maddow focuses on has also shrank significantly. Of course, there are reasons for the discrepancy. According to the report, women tend to work more part-time jobs. More women leave the workforce to care for children and the elderly. Women tend to choose more family-friendly occupations. All of these things result in a work history that just cannot demand as high a wage. The report concluded, quote, "The differences in the compensation of men and women are the result of a multitude of factors, and that the raw wage gap should not be used as the basis to justify corrective action. Indeed, there may be nothing to correct. The differences in raw wages may be almost entirely the result of the individual choices being made by both male and female workers." A different study from June and Dave O'Neill for the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded, quote, "The gender gap is attributable to choices made by women considering the amount of time and energy to devote to a career as reflected in years of work experience, utilization of part-time work, and workplace and job characteristics. There is no gender gap in wages among men and women with similar family roles. What the average woman sacrifices in earnings from choosing jobs that allow for part-time work and flexible work conditions is presumably offset by a gain in the utility of time spent with children and family." Of course, the other side has their studies already, but there are two things to note. One, they don't take all of the other factors into consideration. Maybe they look at one or two, but it's not a full regression analysis with all known factors. Two, and this is the biggie, they don't even attempt to measure actual discrimination. They just control for one or two other factors, and everything left over is just assumed to be discrimination. When logically, the conclusion of the study should be not discrimination, but we just don't know. It's an argument from ignorance, plain and simple.
Women in this country still make 77 cents on the dollar for what men make. So if women don't make less than men?
Actually, if you start looking at the numbers, Rachel, there are lots of reasons for that.
Wait. Well, don't tell me the reasons are. Do women make less than men for doing the same work?
No, because...
Wow.
Well,
hey, Rachel, if you actually stopped interrupting the guy and let him get a sentence or two out, you might learn something about how statistics work. When controlled for factors such as education, experience, and work history, women do not make significantly less than men with a similar background.
Would hire only women, save 25%, and be hugely profitable.
I feel like this is actually... I mean, it's weird that you're interrupting me.
Jeez.
What I wanted to talk about there was policy, about why Republicans would not support a common sense solution to a very specific part of the problem.
Oh, shut up, Maddow. You can't have any effective solution if you don't properly identify the problem. See, these statistics do point to a problem, but it's not workforce discrimination. Why are women's backgrounds so different? Why do fewer working women have college degrees? Why do they end up with less experience? There are all sorts of things we need to be looking at to diagnose this issue, and for some bizarre reason, Maddow just does not want to do that. In addition to the other factors, there may also be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. Advancement, upward mobility, including promotion as well as moving to another job with better possibilities, necessitates taking risks. If a woman is just concerned that there may be discrimination, may be fewer opportunities for women, regardless of whether or not any discrimination actually exists, she may be more reluctant to take these risks. After all, why take that amount of risk for a smaller chance of success? And that results in women having fewer opportunities for advancement. Maddow, by perpetuating this workplace discrimination, which can be shown not to exist to any statistically significant degree, is just fostering the inequality.
I think this is why this debate has been so, talking past each other, so incoherent and dissatisfying. Republicans think that you solve the war on women perception problem by having your presidential candidate be seen with women. Judd Gregg was one of those Republicans who voted no on the Fair Pay Act. Because there is no fair pay problem, right? Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, who Mitt Romney has been praising as a hero, he just repealed the state-level version in Wisconsin of the Fair Pay Act.
I wonder if Maddow has ever considered the possibility, no, scratch that, the reality, that if employers are afraid that women will sue them for discrimination for not being paid as much, even if a man wouldn't be paid any more than that with equivalent experience, work history, and so forth, then they'll just become more reluctant to hire women to begin with. Or at least reluctant to hire women with deficits in their resumes that result in lower wages. And arguably, those are the women you want to help the most. This is not theory. This is exactly what happened to handicapped people after the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. Firms hired fewer handicapped workers because of the fear of being sued if every last little part of their business wasn't up to the immense and ever-changing bureaucratic standards. It just makes things worse. All a law preventing workplace discrimination does is the equivalent of putting electrical tape over the check engine light. You're not actually doing anything to fix the real problem because the problem occurs way before the job application is even filled out. But you are covering over an important indicator of how well we're able to fix the problems in our society that lead to these inequalities to begin with. In other words, it just makes it worse. And for her to continually advocate such a policy, while doing little more than insulting and belittling the people who are trying to point out the problem with her thinking, when she's just trying to mask a symptom, and when it's not going to have the results she wants, is all that it takes for Rachel Maddow to be this week's Idiot Extraordinare! Well, that wraps up this analyzing, tantalizing, agonizing, tranquilizing, galvanizing, compromising, unsurprising, and chastising edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free, but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Elinor Ostrom. There is no reason to believe that bureaucrats and politicians, no matter how well-meaning, are better at solving problems than people on the spot, who have the strongest incentive to get the solution right. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported License.
Bogosity.